Taped by Eunice Blackburn, Marshalltown, Iowa, March 1987. My niece, Wilma Charlotte Warden, was born May 26, 1914, in a rural home near Van Cleve, Iowa, and Melbourne, Iowa, both in Logan Township, Marshall County. She was the first living child of Mabel Blackburn Warden and Harlan Warden, both native Iowans. Harlan was a farmer, and Mabel had taught school in rural schools and in Van Cleve. In the winter, when Wilma was not quite a year old, her mother had a serious illness attributed to blood poisoning. She was kept at home as hospitalization was not common in our area. Harlan and a hired girl, who was really an older woman, cared for her in the home. The small-town doctor called each week or was phoned if an emergency arose. Remember that our homes had no electricity or indoor plumbing. Houses were heated by cook and heating stoves. Fuel was wood, coal, and corn cobs. Roads and highways were not paved, not even graveled, and truly black mud in rainy months. Cars were apt to be mired down. Horses were more reliable, harnessed to a buggy or a light wagon. So, with her mother ill in bed, little Wilma was taken to Laurel, Iowa, about 7 miles away, to stay with grandmother and grandfather Charlotte and Edward Blackburn. Aunt Eunice's, my old high chair, was pressed into service, and the little girl was content with Aunt Lila, then 31, teaching in country school, and Aunt Eunice, 11, to play with her. Grandfather was a great favorite babysitter, too. When warm days came and she went up home, Wilma was not ready to go into the arms of her mother. So Mabel cried when Wilma turned away from her. Lila stayed for several days to bridge the gap. The child knew her father, who had visited Laurel at different times. He even rode the 7 miles 2 or 3 times on horseback. Wilma was really the only grandchild that Edward knew, as he died of cancer of the stomach in 1916, following an operation in University Hospital. Sister Laura June and brother Leonard Warden were born in 1917 and 1923. Actually, 4 other children, all boys, died at birth or in days. All are buried in Logan Cemetery, a quarter-mile up the side road from the Warden homestead. I recall talk of jaundice and hemophilia. Leonard, last boy, was given some special care and was rather spoiled as a baby. His dad bought a wee overhaul for his birthday, #1, when my roommate and I were home from college for the big Thanksgiving meal in the country. The Wardens know more of the school days than I do, and we'll talk of that. However, when Wilma graduated from Van Cleve High School in 1932, she wanted to take nurses training. Their high school had not offered chemistry, so she asked if she could stay at Grandmother Blackburn's home in Marshalltown and attend junior college. College classes were in the high school building just a block west of the Blackburn home. Transportation was not a problem, and tuition was modestly priced. I don't recall that she took other classes, but perhaps English and history. Aunt Lila was teaching country school but living at home, and Aunt Eunice was teaching in Newton, Iowa High School and home only at vacations. This was 1930s depression in Iowa, and money was tight. Wilma's parents supplied meat, and Grandma Blackburn had a large garden and canned fruit and vegetables. We had a wooden ice box in the basement, and Lila would drive to the ice house and buy blocks of ice. These came across town on the back bumper of the car or in a tub inside the car trunk. An iceman also traveled the street once a week, delivering 25-pound or larger blocks of ice. The ice water dripped into a pan beneath the box and was emptied daily. Living was not luxurious by any means. Wilma was not a top student, but she worked hard with Grandma and Aunt to give moral support. The chemistry teacher was a man who often left the lab to take a smoke while students messed around. He did not respond well to questions from a country girl, and the rowdy classroom did not please Wilma. Anyway, she passed chemistry, and when her application to the nursing school at the University of Iowa in Iowa City was accepted, she became one of the girls housed on campus in a dormitory for nursing students. I remember driving the 80 miles with Mother and Lila for a visit. Wilma showed us around her section of the campus. We took a big basket of picnic food with extra pie, cake, and fried chicken to leave for the girls. Wilma did not plan a 4-year degree, but her roommate did. Wilma's diploma came in 1936, and she sent out applications for a job, getting one in Detroit. To our sorrow, Wilma contracted a lung ailment after 2 years while working in the tuberculosis ward of the hospital and had to take a rest cure of several months. She then came home to Iowa. Back here, she was with the Blackburns for about 2 months in the summer and fall, working as a floor nurse in a local hospital. I remember that she thought the equipment and some work rules were not up to those in Iowa City and Detroit. She said bedpans should be near at hand and not shelved in a closet or down the hall. Aunt Lila won her praise for the fine washing and ironing of her uniforms. There was no drip dye or nylon in those days. Grandma tried to fatten Wilma up as illness had left her painfully thin. I was teaching in Newton High, not getting home too often as I had no car and there was no train or bus. After some months in Iowa, Wilma sent out applications for work in a warmer climate and obtained it in Los Angeles. Again, the Wardens know the L.A. years far better than I do. After Wilma married Harry Scott in 1941, 4 small children kept her busy at home. Travel was difficult for them, and I myself visited only once when the Scotts lived on Tivoli in Venice, and the 4 kids were stair-steps and none yet in school. I'd gone out by car with friends and rented a room with neighbors across the street for the week. Some days, Wilma and I would take the family car, pack a lunch, lock all 4 kids in the back seat, and try to see those sights that were free. I enjoyed the nurseries with great plots of flowers. I have a snap of Wilma standing by dahlias as large as dinner plates. One afternoon, we did not get back early enough, and I was amazed to find our wash on the line was still wet, probably with dew. In Iowa, wash on the line would have remained dry and all night. Venice then had many acres of truck gardens, no hippies on the beach nor any huge apartments. Fruit in the stores I found cost as much as we paid in Iowa. The only cheap oranges we got were on one day when we drove to an outlying grove with windfall fruit by the basketful. Oh yes, I experienced a slight earthquake one morning in the Scott kitchen when dishes in the cupboard by my head rattled a bit. I first thought a big truck had gone by the house. I decided then that California was nice to visit, but I would not want to live there. I'm accustomed to flowers inside and out, and Wilma had a huge hanging basket on the porch of red and purple fuchsia. Some weeks after I had visited, Wilma wrote that the kids had pulled their little wagon underneath the hanging basket and stripped off every bloom and then called to her to come see the wagon load of flowers. I don't know, but think the 4 got a paddling. When the Scotts came to the visit in Iowa with the 4 small kids, the Warden home in the country was the home base, and the bunch would come to us for a day. We went to City Park where we played on the playground swings and merry-go-round until everyone was tired. I was usually the pusher power. We didn't swim. We ate lunch at a big picnic table with wieners, a big favorite, potato salad, bananas, and Kool-Aid. A rainy day had left some mud in puddles, and Mike decided to splash before we saw him. Later at home, Wilma took him to the basement for a scrub in the laundry sink as he was too dirty for the bathtub upstairs and we had no shower. The Marshalltown house was the novelty. We had 3 floors and many doors. The Tivoli house was 1 floor and a crawl space. Mike again, upstairs in the hall, shouted, "Me go outdoors," pulled open the door and bounced into a large closet under the attic stairs. The expression on his face as he backed out made us all laugh heartily. Too bad that kids grow up so fast, isn't it? I'm on the 3rd generation in Mabel Warden's family and still enjoy each one.
Because we're taping, I want to add right here that we should go ahead with the Blackburns and the nationality and things, because
Do you have the Blackburn history that you and Wilma were working on?
yes, I've got that. I think I have that because Kay's gone all through that stuff this year. But I think on this we need to talk just like what we know about it, because as growing up, I was always hearing that the Blackburns were.
Do you want this taped right now?
It's all right. It were from England, were English descent anyway. And then there were Irish people, and it was more of the British Isles and from that area, from this, except for the Lukharts, they had some German in them some way. I don't know which one, but we were always told this. And therefore we have on this side, we are Irish and English, more than Scotch on the Blackburn side, and through the grandmothers and all. And on the other side, we come up with all the Scotch people that was in here, because the Wardens came from Scotland, and my grandma Warden, Laura, was a Scotch person, because the name McKean is definitely Scotch. When you say it, it comes out very Scotch. And so therefore we're kind of a grand mixture on this side from the northern part of of England and of Scotland and that area. So then on the Warden side we come up, I'm going to take it with what I've written down here, if I can read it. They came from Scotland because they didn't want to pay the taxes. And so they moved to Vermont. And here was a family with a whole bunch of kids, and they had no money and nothing to do with. And they tried to kick them out of Barnet, Vermont, because there was just going to be some more poor people. Well, within a couple of years, they bought a farm and cleared it and was farming. And, of course, became very permanent citizens, because the Warden farm has been in the family for over 200 years now. And there's the Warden pond on that farm, which was not bought with the first part of the farm, as I read in some of the literature. So, Robert N., my grandfather, that came to Iowa, came in about 1868, or before that, because he taught school in Green Mountain 2 years, and he had taught in Illinois for a while, and he married a gal from Green Mountain, here close to Marshalltown, and he bought the farm, and she became ill, and he took her back to Green Mountain to die. He then proceeded to marry my grandmother, Laura McKean, and she was from Newton, and she taught school in the area, and they raised 5 boys and 3 girls. Harlan was the second boy, and the second child, and the second boy, and he grew up on this farm, and he helped with all the farming operations. He bought a farm. He bought one part of the farm that was east of the road, and then in about 1908 he bought the farm where he lived the rest of his life. They raised 3 children, which is our family. Wilma was the oldest, and there were 4 brothers that did not live. They died as newborns. Wilma had tuberculosis while working in Detroit as a nurse, and the climate in California was recommended, and she wrote and got a job in a hospital in Los Angeles, and she moved to California in 1940. It was about 6 weeks after Kay was born. And she was around to tell us how to do things for Kay. She had to have a scales to know how she was doing. And we thought she could live without it. But she had a scales because Kay bought it for her. Wilma bought it for her. You can shut it off. Church was a part of our lives. Sunday school, young people's meetings, and the young people's meetings usually was on Sunday night, almost every Sunday night. And she started to school in a consolidated school, which took the place of 4 country schools. And our father was on the school board when that school was built. She took part in all the activities of school, basketball, plays, anything that the school did, well, everybody had to take part of. There wasn't enough kids to have a choice. And the school offered most subjects to get you into college. But as Aunt Eunice mentioned, she didn't get her chemistry, so she had to go to get it before she started nurses training. She attended Marshalltown, the junior college in Marshalltown, just 1 year, and then 3 years at Iowa City. At 10, she joined 4-H Club and was county president at one time. Our mother worked with 4-H as well as church and other organizations in the community. And our father was one of the main officers of the church, and he worked with the community and the county and all the organizations. That's it. See what you do. Turn her out.
Is that running?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is Leonard Warden. One of the things that would be interesting about our grandfather was that he walked across the Mississippi. There were not bridges at that time, so his thing was he walked across it 3 times, getting across from Illinois to Iowa, if you can imagine that. Of course, it was on the ice. But then one Christmas Eve, we went to Newton to meet Wilma from Iowa City, and there was a storm, and we got within a quarter mile of home and just about froze getting the rest of the way home, walking. But you wouldn't think a quarter mile would freeze your ears and turn your nose white, but it sure will. When I was a little kid, I can remember being in the front room. Curiosity is wonderful. Wilma had a china egg, and I wanted to see what was inside it. I thought she was going to kill me. But I found out there was nothing in it. Yeah, I broke it. And when she was home recovering from the TB that contracted in Detroit, of course she had spent several months in the hospital, and she was extremely careful about the utensils and dishes and so on that she used so that it wouldn't pass the possible TB on to the other people in the house. And that was, of course, before she went to California. And
Now let's just round table and everybody talk about things. So, Aunt Eunice, she was talking about Harlan and the Hogs. That you didn't get that on the tape.
me and the Hogs.
You and the Hogs.
Yes.
Okay.
I had pigs from the time I was about 10 years old. And that was my 4-H project. And by the time I was 11, my name was in a purebred breeder's book for hogs. And that seems kind of unusual for a 11-year-old kid. But
How about one?
well, Wilma was not much of a farm girl. She was not really interested in the hogs until after they were butchered and able to be eaten. Then it was interesting. So
Neither did she like to make hay. When we were young, we had to drive. They loaded hay on wagons in the field and then hauled it to the house. And one of us had to drive the team on the wagon in the field. And of course, until I got old enough, it was Wilma's job. And oh, she hated those spiders and those daddy long legs. And so when I got old enough, I got that job, and she proceeded to pulling up hay instead of completely. Up to the time that I was old enough to drive in the field, we kind of took turns of pulling up the hay with the horse clear around the other side of the barn. But it was an old horse, and she had a nice long mane, and we would braid her mane, and we would braid her tail in between loads of hay. We kept busy. Sometimes we led the horse, and sometimes we rode her. So it was usually a day's job when you was making hay for everybody. So
that made the hay fork work so they could pull the hay up inside the barn and then drop it.
yeah,
Most modern kids have never seen that done. And of course it was all loose, it was not baled.
I remember one time when we was having a program at school, and it must have been about the time Leonard was a youngster, very small. But the roads were so muddy, and it was spring, and in the spring in Iowa, why the mud gets so that it rolls up on the wheels, even buggy wheels. Buggy wheels are nice and narrow, and they'll usually would go through things. But it was going to be an impossibility to take the car to this school program that night, and of course, being in the program, we just had to be there. And so Dad hitched up the horses with the buggy, and Wilma and I and him went to the program. And there was a lot of kids that didn't make it that night because their folks wouldn't brave the mud. So they had to give up.
I remember one night when he borrowed a school bus, a horse-drawn school bus. And I think it rained all the way there and all the way home from the school function.
Mm-hmm.
But it was 3 miles of mud to get to the schoolhouse and 3 miles back home, and I think it rained all the time.
And there was lots of times that the school bus driver would take more than 2 horses. A lot of times he had 4 horses that
And once in a while,
to pull
6.
the wagon. It was not, but they never shut off school because we couldn't get there. It was always.
You did get there.
So, another thing that I put down on my list was when Wilma was in high school, their home ec project was a wool chalet robe. It was black, and it had to be embroidered, and it had a full back of embroidery. And this was worked on like an hour a day at school. Well, Wilma wasn't getting much done, but it was supposed to be done at school. And finally the teacher was seeing that they could take it home and work on it. The one girl got hers done in a hurry, and the rest of them couldn't figure out how she did it, but she had an aunt and a grandmother that could embroider too. So her robe got embroidered, but Wilma had to do every bit of hers, even though she had to bring it home and do it. But it was a beautiful robe because it was done in all bright colors, and it was like a Japanese robe with kind of wide sleeves and belt around it. And when we were younger, Aunt Eunice talked about the people being a depression. Well, when we were in 4-H, we'd go to camp, and the one year we went to camp, and they put out a list of the things that the parents could bring in lieu of food. They could bring a jar of canned beef. They could bring vegetables, quart jars of vegetables, and they had a price on them that this would take care of their money to go to camp. And so we would take the food, and then we got to go to camp. And Wilma went to camp several times, because I know she went more than I did. I got to go to camp, I think, 4 times out of my 4-H career. But being county president, Wilma had already gone to state convention, and the year she was voted in as county president, it was about 3 days before the state convention, and she didn't know that she was supposed to go to state convention as county president. And so the night before she was to be there, the other girls had already gone. Why, Wilma was still getting her things, had just found out she was to be there, and it was a wild night at our house. But Wilma got there early the next morning. So it was a job. Okay, right?
You were talking about the Depression. I didn't really remember it, but Wilma talked about our dad taking a hog and selling it to get money to pay the tuition at Iowa City to start our nurses training. That's how short money was. But we just didn't have that much money to pay for tuition for one person.
Well, I went all the way through college on borrowed money.
Well,
All the way out, all I went.
but that was just a down payment to get her into college. I mean, and
Now, I don't remember moving into the new house when I was 3, but Wilma would have remembered, because she would have been 6 that year. And the house was finished in 1920, to the point where we moved in anyway. Maybe all the steps and the front porch and things weren't done, but it was so we could move in. And up to that time, the old house had sat just east of where they built the new house, and the tree that we always had our swing on was in front of the old house. And where the well was a part of the back porch. It was inside the back porch of the old house. It took me a long time to figure that out. that had been that back porch on the old house, because I remembered the old house after it had been moved over for the hired man. And I knew it had that little dark back room. And so I was, you just put things together as you grow up.
the slab of cement is still around the well where that room was, east of the house that I live in now.
Well, Mother probably washed in that.
Well, that was what they called the summer kitchen. They would heat the water up on a stove and do the washing so that the main house wouldn't get hot in the summertime more than necessary.
Or wet in the winter.
Our father was instrumental in getting REA electricity into the area in about, 1938 or 39?
Yeah, something like that.
But the house I live in was built with a Delco electric generator and an engine. So the house I live in has always had electricity, but it was 32 volts at one time, and of course now it's switched over to 110. But the wires were so heavy to carry the 32 volts that there was no need to change the wiring to go to 110, because the electric wires were almost 3 times the size of an ordinary modern 110 electric system.
And that goes along with the bathroom too. The bathroom was built when they built the house, and the water was from a shallow well, and there were times of the year that you were kind of low on water. And if it wouldn't pump into the house, you could still pump it with the pump outside. Therefore, when the water was scarce, why, you carried water and to flush toilets and to do all the other dishwashing and things. So you learn to be very Scotch with
Careful
your
with water.
So, but I can remember as a younger child, at the time I hated to read. I had to learn to read, and I had been given several books for Christmas, and so everybody sat around in the kitchen table or by the kitchen cook stove. The rest of the house was all shut off. You just heated the kitchen and lived in the kitchen, but you slept upstairs. But that year, Wilma was reading all the magazines, and Dad read magazines, and Mom read magazines, and I would read one chapter out of a book, and then I would embroider. I hated doing both, but then I had to do something because everybody else was reading. So it was just one of those things. I had learned then that you had to learn to read if you lived in a family that read. It was just a part of their way of living. And I guess I never learned to play games because that was what we did at our house, was to read.
Now, in the winter time, we had 3 rooms that we used in the big house to live in. The front 2 rooms were shut off with the doors, and so mainly the 3 rooms, the kitchen and the dining room and the room to the west, was the 3 rooms we lived in during the main part of the winter because of the fuel. Just like now, it costs a lot for fuel. So
upstairs.
yeah, but we did sleep upstairs all the time. I mean,
And if the wind was in the east, we did things in the bedroom.
we're in the west room.
And if the wind was in the west, we did things in the dining room.
It made a difference.
Sure made a difference what the weather was. So, I think Mother always ironed in the dining room, but no, when she had heated the irons on the stove, why, she ironed in the kitchen.
Yeah, you had to have the cook stove to heat the irons.
And we didn't have an electric iron until we had REC, the electricity come
Which
through.
was like 39 or 1940, somewhere in there. And
Probably 38, because I think the year we lived at the big house, they put all the electricity in.
well, I forget the exact year.
The
but
extra
then,
things,
yeah.
the extra things like plug-ins and things that they needed.
And of course, there were no refrigerators, things like dishwashers and that kind of stuff.
Oh, remember?
Those hands did the work.
Can you remember the time that you swung the kitchen door shut when Wilma was getting the milk out of the refrigerator?
Probably
You
it
were-
happened several times.
No, just once, especially that we remember, because she would lean out. The iceless refrigerator was just outside into the great entrance in the kitchen, outside the kitchen door, and she would hook her little finger around the door jamb, a place in the door, and she would reach out to the refrigerator to get what she was going to get.
Now that's the hinge side of the door.
And that day, Leonard was playing, and he swung the door shut, and it cut her finger off at the top, at the last joint, all but a skin. And it was getting dark, and the folks said to me, well, you take Leonard and you go over to the hired man's. And this was down through the bottom, and it got dark faster down in the bottom, and I was afraid. But we got over to the hired man's, but the folks took Wilma and they went to the doctor and he sewed her finger back on, and I think she used it the rest of her life.
I think she was able to use it.
So it was one of those little things that started in fun and something happened.
Now the refrigerator she was referring to, the box went down into a well so that the milk and other butter and so on would be a little bit cooler than sitting on a shelf in the kitchen. I mean, it would go down 15 or 20 feet down in the ground, and it was cooler than, of course, inside the kitchen.
It was even lower than the basement.
Yeah, it was down below the bottom of the basement.
14 feet.
And
We would drop spoons down and they would just go down there and land, and then about once a year Dad would crawl in under the steps and get all the silverware. He was the only one that was small enough to crawl under those steps. So, and I guess I worried about it when he did it. Even then it was a tight place to me, so it bothered me. My grandfather's mother was, when she was first married, it was in blackberry season, and she was already pregnant and with him, and they went to the woods to pick blackberries, and she and a sister, and some way the horse got excited as they were getting in or out of the buggy, and as you got in and out of the buggy, there was a place to step up on the buggy, but most people stepped up on the wheel. And she apparently stepped up on the wheel, and the horse started, and it broke her leg, and they had to remove the leg. And I understood it was removed just below the knee, and therefore she raised her whole family because she was just pregnant with the first baby, and I understood she used a chair in the house to get around with the stub of her leg on the chair, and then her father carved out a leg for her, which she used. And this would have gone back a long ways in the family, so that was would have been a great grandmother.
but following along with that, my dad said that that lady taught his father how to use a scythe for cutting grain with the cradle, like cutting oats or wheat. They had to cut the grain by hand, of course, with a heavy scythe and a cradle, and she taught the children how to use that scythe.
So apparently she did everything.
But she was out in the field teaching those kids how to work that scythe and harvest grain with that.
And we were also talking about our grandfather going back to Vermont, and it sounded to us like it was every year. Maybe it was every 5 years or something, because there was a lot of years in there. But they've always talked about him taking one or two of the children and going back to see his parents. And one time they got back there and they was without a horse, or something happened to the horse that they were using, and they drove into some relative's yard, and he went to the lot and caught a horse and hitched the horse up and went on to a family reunion. When he drove into the family reunion, why, everybody says, "You're driving that horse?" Because that was the horse that nobody drove. So,
well, that particular horse had never been driven single on a buggy before. And it wasn't that they borrowed the horse. It was because they were able to drive it.
So,
the kids nowadays have an idea how far it is from California to Iowa. My father told about it had to be in 1880s, of a family of relatives coming from Los Angeles going to Vermont. Now they made the trip every 3 years with a team of horses and a buggy. Now, if that didn't take a lot of nerve to start out clear across the desert and clear to Vermont, and then he said in about 2 months they'd be going the other way, heading back home. And they would stop at the Warden farm, rest the horses for 2 days, and then they'd be on their way again. But it would take almost a month and a half driving every day to get from California to Vermont. And he said those were fine, fancy driving horses. Now, my grandfather had work horses and driving horses and a couple saddle horses. But the ones the people from California had were very fine driving horses. And he said that was quite an honor just to water them. Of course, he was a little kid, even so.
Then you were talking about the story about Mom taking the stuff taking the butter and the cream and things to Van Cleve. Somebody want to come up with that one?
Well, that has to be my story, I suppose, because I was a small youngster, and I used to go up and stay at my brother-in-law's for a week in the summer sometime. And, of course, my sister Mabel could drive anything that had 4 legs, and she wasn't afraid of it. My mother was the same way, but my sister Lila hardly would touch a horse, and we had a terrible time when it came her turn to learn to drive a car. So that was the difference. Well, back to the story. Mabel sold butter. She would put it in jars, stone jars or stone crocks, and I remember we had the top buggy. It had 1 horse, and we would have the stone jars or the crocks with the butter. Sometimes we had them in the front seat or the back seat. And it was about 3 miles, I suppose, to the small country store. And one time I was elected to ride along. And when we got to the store, this horse was somewhat fractious, didn't like to stand still. And Mabel had ordered groceries. I don't know whether we handed the list in to the man. Anyway, the thing I remember about it, after we got the stone crocks and the jars of butter unloaded, we were going to get the sack of flour picked up. And there was behind the seat of the buggy, there was a space, like we would think it would be like a little trunk on a car maybe today, and that was where we were supposed to get the sack of flour. Well, there was a loading zone at the store, and the man was going to put the sack of flour in the back of our buggy. The horse didn't like the idea of the man coming out with his white apron, and so we drove around. We ended up by driving around that driveway, practically the store, about 3 times, and finally the man heaved the sack of flour up and got it into the little place at the back of the buggy. So we got the flour home all right, but that was quite an exciting ride.
Now, Tina, we've done some reminiscing. Lisa, we've done some reminiscing, and we've told lots of things. We might not have said the right things that you want to know, but we are also going to include some copies of papers that have been written by different parts of the families, of the Warden family. And so we will send those along, and you can read those through, and if you have questions, guess you'll just have to do without the answers for this paper. Or give us a call. And we hope you find what you need, and we've provided it. So, bye-bye.
It goes clear back to the Declaration of Independence, if you really want to get interested. One of the McKeans signed that. And it might be interesting to know that somewhere in the background we're related. But down at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence is I think it's Tom McKean.
Thomas McKean. It's a real little signature.
But when you signed that thing, you were saying, Crown of England, come kill us. So it took a lot of nerve.
So we
Really?
can